Oh, Canada, our home and native land, true patriot love in all thy sons command. With growing hearts we see thee rise, the true and strong and free. From far and wide, O Canada, we stand on guard for thee. From far and wide, O Canada, we stand on guard for thee. God keep our land glorious and free. O Canada, we stand on guard for thee.
Welcome to Good Seats Still Available, a curious little podcast devoted to exploring what used to be in professional sports. Here's your host, Tim Hanlon.
All right, let's do this, everybody. How are you? My name's Tim Hanlon, as announced. I appreciate that from our dulcet-toned announcer, Mr. Corey Coates. Thank you, sir, always as always. And this is the podcast that is devoted to what used to be in professional sports, our curious little journey each week into that genre. We call it Good Seats Still Available. I appreciate tremendously you finding us on whatever device that you have downloaded and or streamed us. And if it's a return visit, we welcome you back. And if it's your first time here, we can't be more thankful for giving us a try in the vast array of podcast choices that are out there for you. And we're humbled. We're grateful for your giving us a few minutes of your time, and hopefully we'll entertain and maybe even educate you a little bit. I do want to say at this very moment, however, I do want to apologize to all of our Canadian listeners who probably endured that clip at the top of the show and maybe even are scratching their heads as to like, what the hell was that? Well, what that was, of course, was an attempt at the Canadian National Anthem. And if you're a Canadian football fan, Canadian Football League in particular, you may remember an interesting period of time in the early to mid 1990s, in particular 1993 to 1995, when the Canadian Football League, the CFL, got stars in their eyes, shall we say, and eyed this sort of wacky thing called expansion. And not only was it just expansion generally, and maybe even considered in the country of Canada, but south of the border, actually the United States. Let's put teams in the Canadian Football League, expand them into the United States. What a great idea. And for a while it actually was. And there's some interesting pockets of history and some anecdotes here that you'll see that the Canadian Football League was not completely in left field by trying to consider some still relatively fertile professional environments in the United States as expansion franchises. But as we'll hear in our conversation with journalist and longtime sportswriter Ed Willis, he, the author of a fascinating book about that 3-year period of time with the CFL called End Zones and Border Wars, the Era of American Expansion in the CFL, you're going to hear a whole bunch of crazy, unbelievable, and just downright wacky stories and anecdotes and mishaps and malapropisms and you name it about this insane little adventure of the CFL as it decided and pursued expansion in the United States. That clip that you heard was from a 1994 game between the Las Vegas Posse and, I don't even remember what team they were playing, but it kind of doesn't really matter because the team didn't last. It barely lasted a year. But the singer And this is a good example, a good microcosm of the league itself. His name was Dennis K.C. Parks, I believe it was. He has under the pseudonym of Greg Bartholomew, sang or attempted to sing the national anthem of Canada, called, of course, O Canada, referred to as O Canada. But after a couple of bars, kind of got lost with the tune and kind of defaulted. Got the lyrics right, good for him. But the tune, unmistakably, sounded a lot more like "Oh Christmas Tree," and that's what you heard and got. And it became a very famous clip. I think most Canadian sports fans know that clip very well. But it's indicative of just a crazy series of stories and history and anecdotes around this silly, unbelievable, hard to believe 3-year adventure in the 1990s of the CFL and its American expansion. And that is the conversation today, this week, with Ed Willis, coming up in a couple of seconds. I encourage you to listen early, listen often. Maybe you want to repeat a few things because there will be some things that you're just not going to believe, frankly, in this chat with Ed coming up. So promotionally, let's talk about a few things, shall we? Audible books or Audible audiobooks, of course, one of our longtime sponsors. We appreciate them tremendously. And if you want a free audiobook download to give a trial, shall we say, of what an audiobook is all about, you couldn't do any worse than by going to audibletrial.com/goodseats and getting yourself a free 1-month subscription to the Audible service. And, of course, getting a free audiobook download from the gigantic trove of over 180,000 titles to choose from. And there are all kinds of genres out there for you to enjoy. Just pick one. I think you'll enjoy the process. You'll enjoy listening, and I think you'll enjoy the whole concept of listening to a book versus having to strain your eyes and read it as such. You can cancel at any time, and you'll be given a little bit of love to us financially. We always appreciate that because Lord knows we're not a charity. We need a little scratch to kind of keep us going here to get these great stories like the CFL conversation we're going to have in a second to you. And by going to audibletrial.com/goodseats and giving the service a try and getting a free audiobook download, you're going to be helping us along the way. So we appreciate Audible for their sponsorship, and we appreciate you for giving them a shot as well. We tremendously appreciate it. Also, our friends at sportshistorycollectibles.com is well worth your time. They are there for you to explore all kinds of interesting memorabilia and stuff from teams and leagues, either in different incarnations or frankly just no longer with us. You name the sport, there's probably a chance that sportshistorycollectibles.com, if not now, very soon, will have all kinds of interesting inventory for you to consider, to choose, to see lushly photographed and presented on the website. And of course, if you find something that just immediately tickles your fancy, either for you or a friend, a loved one, and you want to make that purchase, you want to make a couple of purchases, well, we've got you covered, friend. Make sure you use the promo code GOODSEATS. Yep, that's GOODSEATS. That's the promo code, because when you decide to buy something, you just enter that little promo code there at checkout. And what are you going to do? You're going to get 15% off your purchases. SportsHistoryCollectibles.com. Use the promo code GOODSEATS and get 15% off all of your purchases. So that's awesome. We thank them as well, of course. All right, so let's get to our fun chat with an amazing, interesting curiosity, an asterisk, if you will, of pro football history, the Canadian version of such, the CFL and its various exploits in the early to mid-1990s as they expanded to the United States. A fun chat, and here it is with Ed Willis. The CFL, right, a very fascinating league on a whole bunch of different levels, but perhaps no more fascinating than this period during the early to mid-1990s, where the siren song, I guess, of the United States came knocking on the door, I guess. And you have, I think, frankly, have written a definitive book about that period of time, which, as you know, in this show, we are, for whatever reasons, we are fascinated and or obsessed with teams and leagues and situations that are no longer with us. And we appreciate your taking time and stuff. So do you maybe want to give our audience a little bit of background about who you are and your career path and all of that, and then maybe if you can figure out a way to smoothly segue into why you felt a book about this particular period of time in the CFL's history.
Well, I kind of share your obsession with past leagues and stories from those leagues, which quite frankly scares me a bit. I am 62. I've been a sports writer for 35 years. I started in a small town in Alberta, and I kind of worked my way up. I worked in Regina. I worked in Winnipeg for 8 years. I had a freelance gig in Montreal where I did a lot of work for the New York Times for a year, and that led to my current position as a columnist with the Vancouver Province, now the Vancouver Province, and the Vancouver Sun. Mostly writing hockey, hard to do, hard to get around that in Canada, but I had a wide variety of things. I've covered 9 Olympics, 5 Super Bowls, probably half a dozen majors. I was in a time when newspapers still had money and still had a bit of a travel budget, but I would see a fairly well-rounded career. I think I've checked a lot of boxes in my time as a sports writer.
So you're a quintessential classic newspaper sports reporter guy, right?
Last of a dying breed, unfortunately. There are a few of us still left hanging on, trying to fight the good fight. Sometimes it feels like a losing battle, but there's still something about the experience of sitting behind a computer and crafting a story, trying to bring something to life that is endlessly rewarding and entertaining. So I've got no complaints. I've had a great run.
Well, so give us a sense then of your experiences with. I'm assuming that covering the teams of and the league itself of the Canadian Football League over the years was part of your assignments for your job and for personal passion, I guess, too. No.
Yeah, well, it's kind of funny because during the era of American expansion, I was in Winnipeg, but I was the hockey columnist there. As such, I was kind of like dimly aware of all this craziness that was going on, but I wasn't there covering it on a day-to-day basis like so many of my colleagues were. So the genesis of the book actually starts. The BC Lions are hosting the Grey Cup in 2005, and we're doing a special edition, a standalone. Kind of to sell as part of the Grey Cup package. And I had always been fascinated by that 1994 Grey Cup game between the Baltimore, then CFLers, and the BC Lions. And that was, it was the second year of expansion, but it was really the first year. There was I believe there were 3 American teams in the league that year. Baltimore was a success story. It turned into this huge Canadian nationalism story because it was the first time an American team was competing for the Grey Cup, and that Baltimore team was loaded. And the BC Lions team, I knew a lot of the people around. They were still around Vancouver, and I knew there was an endless supply of characters there. And I had heard some of the stories, so I did a little deeper dive into it. And I was just amazed by the richness of the characters and the stories connected with that game. And there was just a little light that said, I think there's a book here. I think if I start getting a little deeper into the whole era of American expansion, I think it's going to be a lot of these kind of stories. And that's what I did. So, spent the better part of a year poking away at it. Some people were hard to find, and I didn't cover all the bases, but I think I succeeded in painting a picture of what the league was like, the dire straits the CFL were in, how desperate they were, the people they turned to in the States, the follies that incurred thereafter, and then the sort of from a CFLer's point of view, the happy ending at the end of all this, when it looked like the league was about to crater because it's out of the ashes of this failed experiment that the CFL actually saves and resurrects itself.
So you weren't a beat reporter during this period of time at all, but
no.
Really part of the sports landscape, obviously in your day job, albeit with other sports, et cetera.
Yeah, no, it was funny. I was, my time in Saskatchewan, I covered the Rough Riders. When I started in Winnipeg, I was a general columnist, so I did a lot of football. And then I was just happened to be concentrating on hockey. Now, my current gig in Vancouver, I've covered the CFL for the last 20 years, so I've always been around it. And I was raised on CFL legends. My mother's from Regina, and my dad's a farm boy from Alberta, and they love the CFL, so it's always been a part of my life. So I never strayed that far from it. I just didn't have that kind of firsthand knowledge. Like I said, a lot of my colleagues did, but they were very helpful and very generous when I went to research it.
Well, so to give our audience, obviously a lot of our audience lives in the United States, but you will be surprised and shocked perhaps at some of the various nooks and crannies around the globe. I mean, we're talking places like Bahrain and Djibouti, believe it or not, and New Zealand and all that stuff. But maybe you can give our audience, both American football snobs and otherwise, a little bit of a quick primer on the Canadian Football League, which has been around for, I think, for many sort of naive Americans, a whole long time, and has been probably as old in an establishment, maybe even preceding that of, say, the mighty NFL. Can you give our audience a bit of a sense of sort of the uniqueness and or the commonality, I guess, around the CFL before we kind of delve into how we got to the 90s?
Sure. And again, I'm going to paint in broad strokes here, but football has been played in Canada in one form or another since the 1880s. And the Grey Cup has been competed for. It was originally presented as a Challenge Cup, but it's been over 100 years. I believe the first one is don't hold me to this, but it's sometimes around World War I, because the 2012 game in Toronto was the 100th anniversary, and I know there was years they missed in there. So I mean, it has got this long, rich history. Now, as a league, as a standalone entity, the CFL has really only existed since I'm going to say the early to mid 50s. But there were all kinds of Western interprovincial leagues and Ontario-Quebec leagues and things like that. And each of these leagues would produce their own champion, and then they would face off for the Grey Cup. It becomes unified at some point in the 50s as a 9-team entity. Teams, when they expand to Vancouver in 1954, I believe it was, they become the 9th team. So now you've got teams in Montreal, Ottawa, Toronto, Hamilton, Winnipeg, Regina, Calgary, Edmonton, and Vancouver, and that's kind of the CFL everybody grew up with. Now, the league has kind of had a boom and bust mentality throughout its history. There have been times when they've been able to compete for the very best players coming out of the States. In the 1950s, Sam Echeverry was, I believe, an All-American quarterback, star in the CFL for many years with the Montreal Alouettes, and then goes and finishes his career with the St. Louis Cardinals. Cookie Gilchrist got his start in the Canadian game in the 50s. In the 60s, players like Vic Washington, Bo Scott, a little later Mac Heron, all started in Canada. The Montreal Alouettes, long before their ill-fated chasing of American football stars, they brought Tom Cousineau to the CFL when he was was slated to be the first overall draft pick in the NFL draft. So there have been times when the CFL has I shouldn't say challenged, but they've been competitive with the very best players. And then there are times when they've kind of teetered on the brink of disaster. And the period we're going to talk about was probably the most glaring example of that, because it was for a whole host of factors. The league was just hanging on by its fingernails, which is why they basically turned to this idea of American expansion as seed money to keep the operation going.
Yeah, that's really interesting. We'll get to that in a minute, but perhaps as more of a bit of a prelude, there's always been sort of this interesting, I guess, fascination by football fans in the United States. Maybe more as a curiosity than an out-and-out obsession or fascination, right? With the version of football, American football, quote unquote, played above the border, both in terms of, say, the size of the field and the number of the downs and the approach to scoring and all that kind of stuff. But it even there are some dalliances over the years, right, with some U.S. neutral site games and even some bits and pieces of television coverage, even before we get to, say, the 80s and 90s when, television was exploding and there were, people seeking sports programming in from all corners of the globe.
Oh, yeah, no, 100%. And by far the most fascinating game, and would that they were filming this one, but I believe it was played in Ottawa, and it was against the New York Giants and the Ottawa Rough Riders. And I dug and I finally found game reports of it. So if I remember right, they played two halves, and they played the first half with American rules and the second half with Canadian rules. And that New York, it was coached, I'm pretty sure Ali Sherman was the coach. I'm pretty sure Wyatt Tittle played in that game for the Giants. And I don't know who else would have been, but it would have been very close to the team that, played the Baltimore Colts in the famous 57 NFL championship game. So there's that one. I believe the longest sort of sustained series was against the early AFL teams. And I know that, like, the Buffalo Bills played the Hamilton Tiger Cats. I think there were 3 or 4 of those games in the early 60s. So they have gone, there is a bit of a history there, for sure, which predated, that area you're talking about. When, the CFL kind of, becomes a bit of a curiosity piece for ESPN when they're starting off and some of the other cable networks.
Yeah, that's very interesting. I was naive or unaware of that, the NFL exhibition and even the AFL exhibition and games against the CFL. I was just even thinking about just some simple neutral site games, especially in the 50s and 60s, where 2 teams from the CFL came to places like, Portland, Oregon, and a few other places to kind of, I guess, demonstrate the sport. But it's also very interesting, too, that from my crack research here, my understanding is that the 1954 NBC sports unit covered 13 games of the, I guess it wasn't officially known as the CFL at that point, but just before it. I think ABC in 1962 even had the Grey Cup final, which was, famously known as the Fog Bowl. I don't think even the game finished. You mentioned ESPN in 1981, which was obviously a fledgling all sports network looking for as much programming. But I think most interestingly, and I saw a bunch of these things on YouTube a couple of days ago when searching this up, when the NFL struck, the players' strike occurred in 1982. Talk about a scramble for NBC and CBS in the States to fill the time for at least those weeks with football-related programming. CBS went sort of the small division college route in the United States. But who came a-calling in 1982? NBC up north. And instead of being in San Diego for a big AFC battle between the Chargers and somebody, maybe the Raiders, you saw Dick Enberg and a heavily bearded Merlin Olsen in Commonwealth Stadium in Edmonton and looking no worse for the wear.
I was unaware of that. It doesn't surprise me a bit. I'm, sort of, again, like aware of those one-offs. Why do I want to say that broadcast of the Fog Bowl was part of Wide World of Sports? It was ABC, was it not? That's my recollection, at least. So, yeah, yeah. But and again, I think the larger point here is there's kind of always been this sort of not a deep connection, but there's always been a curiosity, maybe even an interest in the games going across the borders. And I think from the Americans' point of view, and going back to this history Canada's had of attracting top U.S. college players to Canada, that's always been like a significant part of the CFL story. Again, whether it's Sam Edgeworth or whether it's Johnny Manziel today. So yeah, I think that probably helps explain at least part of the interest in it.
Well, so let's get into, obviously, let's start skating into the CFL circa early 1990s. And perhaps an interesting little inflection point that could be helpful to our audience is we obviously know that the USFL had been going on during the early part, the mid part of the 1980s, but the NFL was also rumbling around with this thing called the World League of American Football, which was sort of an attempt to kind of Europeanize the game and get some teams interested and sort of internationally spread out the sport. But it's important to know that the WLAF story a bit, because it was also part of the germination, I guess, of what the American expansion wound up becoming in the CFL. But maybe before we get there, what was the CFL like in the early 90s? Because it does sound like, especially the way you've written it, you said hanging by its fingernails, but some really trying times for this league that arguably was, well historied and ingrained in Canadian sports, the Canadian sports landscape.
Yeah, well, again, in keeping with this theme of the boom and bust mentality, they had a rich television contract with Carling O'Keefe that really paid the bills and ensured viability for all 9 of the teams. And I'm going to say it ran out in 1986. And there was nothing to replace it. There was a very war going on in Canada, and the CFL was seen as this property they had to line up with, and then it just kind of disappeared, and teams were left scrambling. So this period of crises really it's really running for about 3-4 years, and they kind of, there's a kind of some successes and there's troubled franchises, but as the CFL always does, they struggle on and they find a way to make it to the next payday. Early 90s, a couple of things happen, not the least of which is Bruce McNall shows up as the owner of the Toronto Argos. And, in so many ways, he epitomizes this era because, he promises flash, he promises the stars and to bankroll this operation, which is almost like a borderline NFL team. They go out and they sign Rocket Ishmael. The most famous, I don't know where, I can't remember if he was going to be the first overall pick that year. I believe he was, to Oakland. But they swoop in and sign him up. They've got John Candy as one of the owners of the team with Wayne Gretzky, so they've got this Hollywood connection. So they're selling this, glitz and glamour, and of course Bruce McNall didn't have 2 nickels to rub together, so he'd soon be painfully obvious to everybody. So that kind of is going on in BC. There's another fly-by-nighter by the name of Murray Pezim, who's a stock promoter, who would easily gain and lose millions of dollars in any week, and when he was flush, he was fine, but as often as not, he would lose whatever he made. But he brings Doug Flutie to the CFL too. So there's this promise that the league is entering this exciting new era with great stars and all the rest of it. But underneath it, there's these people just didn't have the money, just didn't have the wherewithal to sustain anything over the long term.
This also comes on the heels of in the 80s, the late 80s in particular. Well, a couple of times in the 80s, perhaps maybe a symbolic, perhaps precursor of some of the troubles in the story of the once again, then not, and then yet again, Montreal Alouettes. Maybe a little bit of background on that, because that I think it's a good scene setter for perhaps. I'm
sorry, you're right. You're right. The poster boy for the fly-by-night owners in the CFL is a dude named Nelson Scalabania, who's from my hometown, who made a lot of money in real estate, and he was actually the guy who signed Wayne Gretzky in the WHA. But he goes into Montreal, and the Alouettes had been a wildly successful franchise through the 70s, coached by Marv Levy, with a number of players who went on to the NFL and some great CFL players, Hall of Famer, routinely put 50, 60,000 in the Big O. So Nelson Scalabania looks at that and goes, geez, if we bring some NFL stars into this, I can only imagine what we're going to do. So he goes out, he signs Vince Ferragamo, he signs White Shoes Johnson, James Scott from the Chicago Bears, Keith Gary from the Pittsburgh Steelers, a first-rounder, David Overstreet, and they go out and they couldn't beat an egg. And so he's sitting there, and of course, this lasts for 2 years. I believe the year it's in the early 80s. It's 81 or 82 that all this happens. And of course, Galbaney runs out of money, and he's nowhere to be seen. So now the Alouettes are left to scramble. They go through all these incarnations. They become the Concords for a while. They fold. They come back as the Alouettes. And then, as we'll get to it in our discussion of the expansion into the States, they finally come back as the Alouettes. They're actually the Baltimore franchise that ends up in Montreal, and that's when they're saved. But that was like 1997, 1998 before that happened. So this incredibly rich, storied CFL franchise goes through 16 years where it's wandering around in the desert, just trying to survive and sometimes not surviving.
Well, okay, here comes the first of perhaps many naive American questions. It seems to me that the nature of the sort of traditional, or maybe not traditional, owner, or the approach to what the league and how it's sold and marketed and all that kind of stuff was in the midst of an evolution, I guess, in the 80s and certainly in the early 90s, right? My understanding, right, is that a lot of the teams up until about that point were, I don't know, more locally owned or consortium based or community rooted, or perhaps even, community minded, civic minded philanthropist types who, saw it as almost a greater good for the town or the city, and or the Canadian sort of league. Now meeting perhaps some of the brash, younger, maybe more moneyed and or money chasing new blood ownership. Is that a fair assessment?
No, 100% it is, and it's yeah, there is, the business of the game changes dramatically, and the CFL had always operated quite well. All the Western teams, I believe, in that era were community owned. The one privately owned team was the Alouettes, and their owner was a gentleman named Sam Berger, who wasn't he was rich probably compared to you and me, but he wasn't he wasn't like a multi-billionaire by any stretch of the imagination. But he ran this operation and did very well by it. But the CFL was at its best when it was just like plodding along, drawing its 25 to 30,000 fans per game to whatever stadium they were, maybe making a bit of playoff money and then having a raging success in the CFL. And they totally start getting away with that with the emergence of guys like Scalabrini, who doesn't have any staying power, but, you can draw a straight line from him to Bruce McNall, to Larry Rickman, who we'll talk about, I gather, in a little bit, and others of that ilk. Again, venture capitalists is a really polite term for it, because not any of them had the wherewithal to sustain anything, and that really becomes the downfall of the American expansion agreement. And the funny thing is, the guys with real money who bought American franchises were only around for a little while, and they took one look at it and looked at the losses and walked away. They just said sayonara, and that was it for them.
Well, it is also, I guess you could sort of characterize these guys as certainly something quintessentially American, that sort of sports entrepreneur, right? And there's always been a long strain of we've talked about this on many of our previous episodes, right? Sort of this, we always come back to why this league, why an expansion, why this team, why the sport. And a lot of it winds up, sometimes in a torturous way, back to, so-and-so was a businessman, or he or mostly he saw the opportunity to make a buck, right? And we've seen it sort of over and over again, but it almost seems like that sort of, that American arrogance / entrepreneurialism, capitalist kind of mindset almost was a bit delayed, I guess, when it came to the CFL until maybe the modern day 1980s, 1990s.
Yeah, no, and I get that, and I think the other part of the equation is simply it was so cheap to get a seat at the table, compared to what NFL franchises were even then. I mean, you're talking about like a couple of million, and and you can sit and you can entertain the idea of building your own team, and in a place like Toronto or in a place like Montreal, which are fairly big markets. So yeah, like I said, I get that. I guess my point would be why anybody would look at the CFL and think this was the path to untold riches is beyond me. I mean, there is a very well-established history, very well-established business practices, all those things that should have told them this isn't the kind of league where you go in and drop millions. It just doesn't work that way. And that's really, that leads to it eventually. Now, obviously, there are other factors involved, which we're going to get to here. But it was, I guess I just wonder why they thought the CFL would have been profitable to the extent they thought it was going to be profitable.
Well, all right, let's talk about sort of the early 90s in particular. 1992, right? Because there's a gentleman by the name of Larry Smith who becomes somewhat integral to this this big, rich, and sometimes hard to believe chapter of the Canadian Football League's history. Who is Larry Smith, and how did he get to this position? And more interestingly, who was doing the bidding for this idea of possible expansion in the U.S.? Was it him and his thought process, or was he kind of just part of the owners or a group of owners changing desires, I guess, for what the CFL might want to become?
Sure. Well, let's start with Larry Smith. Now, if you're going to do a composite of the perfect commissioner for the CFL, this is the guy you would have come up with. Former player with the Montreal Alouettes, bilingual, fluent in French and English, MBA, I want to say, from McGill. Very accomplished with Ogilvy Foods. He'd been like one of the rising young executives in a huge food company, and he's still, I believe, when he's in his early 40s when he takes over the mantle. So, like I said, if you were going to draw a picture of what you'd want the CFL commissioner to look like, this is who you get. So. And so I'm just drawing a blank on who he succeeded now, but there were overtures made, and they looked at a couple of other guys before they said him. But in talking to Larry for the book, the very first meeting he has, and I want to say, I know Rickman is one of them, but he has said, look, we are going to go ahead with this plan for American expansion, whether you're on board or not. This is already happening. So the wheels had been turning before Smith was hired. They just appointed Smith as the front man to sell the idea, and that became his job. But the direction, the map was already set out, and they were headed down that road, and nobody was going to dissuade them from it.
Yeah, and the guys who were kind of either behind Smith's hiring and or coming up with sort of the agenda, I guess, that Smith was hired gun to become or to sort of make happen. You're mentioning a few of them, right? So one's Larry Rickman out of Calgary. I guess Bruce McNall out of Toronto was sort of part of that mix. Are there any others, and or was it a minority sort of overrun of the owners, or was this sort of a drumbeat with more actors?
Yeah, in going back, I couldn't find anybody who was standing up saying, no, this is a terrible idea. This is going to ruin us. We're going too fast. Look at who we're inviting into our league. Don't let this happen. And if they did, they kept it to themselves. There may have been dissenting voices on the Board of Governors, but they weren't loud, and they certainly weren't public. And by far, and guys like Rickman, who is very much part of this venture capitalist group who saw great things for the CFL and really didn't have a whole lot of money of his own, fits again into that. This McNall, Murray Pezim, Nelson Scalvania kind of club of owners, and he's one of them. If I can just double back, it was they had been talking about expansion to CFL as an ongoing thing right back into the late 80s. Bill Baker was the commissioner of the CFL for a very short time, but I did talk to him, and he said, yeah, it came up at the board, but they were talking. It was a completely different idea. This first incarnation of it, it was smaller border towns. They were looking at going into, and nothing like what it became. So the idea was there. The seed had been planted. And again, when you look at Rickman, when you look at McDonald, when you look at all these guys, you can understand why they thought this was a keen idea, because they're just looking for the seed money from the franchises that they're going to get. And the first guy to step up is Fred Anderson.
So when you say border towns, are you saying American border towns or Canadian?
No. I mean, this was going to be the first, and I'm sorry, I don't have the names. They are in the book, because I remember, Bill rattling them off. And, for the sake of argument, it would have been like Toledo, Ohio, or Boise, Idaho.
Got it.
Kind of smaller American cities that they thought would welcome, it would be an easy sell for the CFL.
Interesting.
And nothing became of that, of course. But, I think the larger point is, the seed had been planted. That idea was in the air. And then when McDowell and Rickman and these other characters come along, you can say, well, why would we go there when we can go to Baltimore and we can go to all these other places who will, spend millions for a CFL franchise?
That's very interesting. Well, it seems that Smith didn't waste too much time, because by the summer of '92, he was already architecting an exhibition game between two teams of the league, the Argonauts and the Stampeders of Calgary. In Portland, Oregon, I think they got something a little over 15,000 at Civic Stadium there at the time. And I guess maybe you've got some color behind this. I guess this was, I don't know, something approaching a showcase game or a test of the proposition that, the Canadian game could maybe make a go of it south of the border.
It certainly turns out that way. Now, I didn't spend a whole lot of time on that game in the book, because there are other things going on. But again, I think it sort of indicates what the mindset of the CFL Board of Governors was at that time. And they were definitely looking at the United States as an answer to a lot of their ills. And I think, the larger development there is the WLAF, and why, if you're picking a league, are you going to pick that as the acronym for your league? But another story for another time.
Yeah, it's actually important, though, right? Because circa 1992, right, it was the second year of this aforementioned World League of American Football, or WLAF, as you like to say. I've never heard that acronym, but we might as well go with it. And it's also very interesting, too, because, right, you've got this exhibition game going on in the summer, and you've got basically the second year of this NFL European/semi-American experiment that really was kind of coming to an end after a 2-year cycle. But it did show, right, that at least in a couple of markets in the United States that didn't already have an NFL franchise, that there were, shall we say, hints of viability to support professional football on some level, right?
Yeah, no, 100%. Yeah, there's a WLAF team in Montreal too that I think exists for a year, and I believe they made the championship game in their 1 year of existence.
Yes,
the other thing
the
is
Montreal machine. The machine.
There we
Montreal.
go. Yeah. So but the other thing is and I think just as is important, it identifies parties interested in owning a football team. And I know, I did a book on the WHA, and that becomes really important, identifying potential owners. People who have a real deep-rooted interest in owning and operating a professional franchise. And Fred Anderson ran it was in the WLAF. It was the team in Sacramento, was it not?
That's correct. The Sacramento Surge.
Surge, who give birth to the gold miners, who become the first team in expansion. But it's Anderson was bound and determined to have a team in Sacramento, and I guess he wasn't all that fussy about the league he was going to join, because when the CFL approaches him, it's a pretty easy sell for them.
Well, and also joined by, although more ill-fated, was Larry Benson of the then San Antonio Riders of the WLAF. I guess the idea was to have them, as the newly rechristened San Antonio Texans, join as basically the first two of the franchises. And I guess it was, I don't know, it was not meant to be, but by January of 93, the CFL, by a pretty large margin, I think Winnipeg was the only dissenting franchise, voted to expand to at least one, in this case, one team, the Sacramento Gold Miners in 1993, the first foray into the United States. I just wonder, and I don't know if you've got an answer to this or maybe some perspective, right? But knowing that the WLAF, the World League of American Football, an NFL-owned venture, was, sort of nearing the end of its 2-year experiment and then figuring out a way to retool it sort of post-1992, and the CFL with hints of wanting to expand. I'm just wondering if there was any, it doesn't seem like there would be outwardly, but you have to think, is it a coincidence that a team that was in the 2-year WLAF owned by the NFL, jumping, if you will, to the CFL, I wonder if there's some sort of coordination there, or at least some kind of understanding between the NFL and the CFL. Would, on its face, not seem to be the case, but I don't know. Maybe it seems like there was some kind of, interesting collaboration there that makes Sacramento and then at least possibly a San Antonio franchise to come in to this new.
Well, if there was, it was well disguised by both parties, which is interesting because there is an agreement between the CFL and the NFL that comes up in '96, where the NFL basically offers an interest-free loan to the CFL to get them through another one of their troubled areas. But no, I never came across that. In fact, the NFL's role in all this is largely villainous from a CFLer's point of view because of the position they took with the Baltimore club. But no, I never got the sense that they'd enlisted the aid or the NFL was interested in any of this.
So the Gold Miners, though, did pretty well, though, right? I mean, I'm curious as to what sort of the Canadian fans and the league itself sort of saw in Sacramento being the one and only American team in 1993. Was it viewed as a success, or was it a curiosity, or uncertain?
I believe encouraging would probably be the best word. And you think of it like a first-year expansion team. Now they rigged the rules. They allowed them to play with all Americans. I should add, in the CFL there are ratios. You have to employ so many Canadian players and so many American players. They threw it wide open for the Gold Miners. I think they go 6-12 in their first year, whatever it is, but they're competitive. And they're also a reasonably entertaining team. The quarterback's a guy named David Archer, who I believe now does color for the Atlanta Falcons TV broadcast. He played in the NFL. He was a very good CFL quarterback for a lot of years. I believe he'd been in the WLAF with the Sacramento team, and he was very tight with Fred Anderson. I think Fred Anderson regarded him almost like a son. So again, encouraging. They don't draw great, but they draw, I think, in the neighborhood of 17,000 to 18,000 per game in a substandard stadium, Hornet Stadium. I've only ever seen pictures of it. I've never been there myself. But it was, it was like a rickety old, no amenities, none of the fancy things you need to generate revenues in professional sports. So that was it. That was the first time, and it was pretty well covered. Like in going over the source material at that time, like most of the big, there was a game there, and I'm pretty sure it's Calgary goes down there with Doug Flutie. And it's a shootout. It's a great CFL game. It's one of these 42-38 games where the ball's going all over the field, and there's a touchdown every 3 seconds. And I know, like, some of the big papers in Toronto sent their, lead columnists out to cover it, and the response, like I said, was kind of this muted optimism, this sense that, maybe we've got something here. We've got an owner, we've got a city that seems to, embrace it. They've got a pretty good team. Maybe they're onto something.
Yeah, that's and that's interesting too, because the harbinger, perhaps of what was to come, is actually interesting around the team that actually did not make the 1993 season, the San Antonio, I guess, Texans. And if I read this correctly, tell me if I've got this right. They were set to announce joining the league maybe at the same time as the Gold Miners, but they pulled out literally the night that they were supposed to announce it in the press conference. Is that right?
So they have it all set up at the league meetings in Edmonton, and it's the dead of winter in Edmonton. I'm going to say it's February or March, but they have it, and Fred Anderson is totally on board. He is committed to this vision, and the league has been talking to Benson about the other team, and they're going to present them together. These are the two new entries in the CFL, the team in San Antonio, the team in Sacramento. So I'm sorry, I'm going to get the names confused, because the Benson who owns it is the brother of Tom Benson, who owns the New Orleans Saints, and he's the guy in the family with all the money. And the way Smith explained it to me, it was like the family basically said to him, "Are you nuts? Do you think we are ponying up for a CFL team the night before?" And they were expecting him to show up. They're all at the hotel waiting for him, and they get a phone call from him that night going, "Sorry, my family won't let me. I'm out." So they go ahead. This is so typical of that era. They go ahead with the press conference the next day, and they introduce Fred Anderson and the new team from from Sacramento, rather. And Fred's there, and he's answering all the questions. I gather he was quite good with the media, and I never met the man myself. And then they go to Smith, and he goes, "Unfortunately, the San Antonio franchise has been suspended for a year. Got to go," and he was off. And of course, the way Smith described it might be hyperbole, but he literally is running through the kitchen of the restaurant in the hotel with the media, and he effects this escape, and then they come out with a cover story the next day that they'll revisit it, and Mr. Benson is trying to line his finance and stuff, but that was it for that team. Ironically, Fred Anderson takes the team to San Antonio in the last year of existence.
How does the sports media take to that? Do they are any flags raised or any eyebrows raised in any of this? It's hard. It was hard to say. Again, going over the resource material, there was some eye rolling, and there was but. They had Fred Anderson, like I said, they had done some things well. So I think, as odd as it may seem, I think they were willing to give them the benefit of the doubt on this one. The problem was it wasn't an isolated case. It was a story that would recur over and over again in this tumultuous period. All right, just when it was getting interesting, let's bring this to a grinding halt, shall we? Just kidding. We got to pay the bills around here, and our friends at Audible have been very helpful in attempting to allow us to pay some of those bills, and we want to call them out now and remind you that a free audiobook download is yours for the taking, and also a free 1-month subscription to the service of Audible at audibletrial.com/goodseats. Again, audibletrial.com/goodseats. for your free 1-month trial of the Audible service, and most interestingly, a free audiobook download for you to enjoy. 180,000 titles and growing every day to choose from, and there's absolutely no excuse to not find at least one title amongst that cavernous selection available to you that you won't find to be enjoyable and good for the soul, including a couple of books that might be interesting to our audience. And yes, some new ones, frankly, that I'm finally listening to. One that I'm listening to right now is by Carson Cunningham. It's narrated by Paul Bamer, and it's called Underbelly Hoops, Adventures in the CBA, a.k.a. the Crazy Basketball Association, which is really, of course, about the Continental Basketball Association, which for many years was sort of this ragtag minor league of the NBA. And it's a book I'm about 2 chapters into right now, and hopefully maybe a guest will get for a future episode. Also, in my queue, next up, is another guest that I'd like to get. And her book that she wrote is also narrated by her. Her name is Jeannie Buss. And of course, Jeannie is the daughter of Jerry Buss, of course, the wildly successful founder of the Los Angeles Lakers and the LA Forum. And Jeannie is clearly today the brains behind the Los Angeles Lakers today. She and her brothers were active, of course, in things like, along with her father, World Team Tennis, the Major Indoor Soccer League with the LA Lasers, all kinds of stuff. So her book is next on my list. That's called Laker Girl, and that too is available on Audible. And again, it's one of the many thousands of titles that you can choose from when you go to audibletrial.com/goodseats. And again, you too can get your free audiobook download to give it a try, perhaps one of those 2, or perhaps one of the other 180,000 titles available to you as well. Give it a try, audibletrial.com/goodseats. Thanks for listening, and back to our conversation. All right, well, let's get to that next season, because that's when really things really start to heat up, right? So the gold miners not only survive, they do, to your point, fairly well. They acquit themselves quite nicely, albeit in a stadium that's a bit subpar. The Sacramento takes to them. And now it's time to add more teams. And there are 3 of them, each with their own little interesting stories. In no particular order, the Shreveport Pirates, as mentioned earlier, the Las Vegas Posse, which is just a head-scratcher in its own way. But maybe we should start with perhaps the team that was probably most, perhaps the best, the biggest quote-unquote success of the American franchises, but also the most, shall we say, acronym challenged, or not acronym, but nickname challenged. The team from Baltimore. Do you want to kind of give us a little bit of history about that?
Yeah. I like it because it really is, at its heart, it's a lovely story, because it rekindles Baltimore's love for the Colts. And this is the Colts team. They will always be the Colts team to me. So again, the background: Robert Irsay is the owner of the Colts, and I believe it's 1987. He does the famous end run where he moves the franchise in the dead of night from Baltimore, rips the heart out of the city, its ancestral home with these incredibly deep connections in the old city of Baltimore, and moves them to Indianapolis and leaves the city without a football team. And the bitterness and the anger and everything that ensued. So it lasts up until the time the CFL shows up. So the owner-operator is a guy named Jim Spiros, who I believe had been a college football player. He's a hustler. He's a young go-getter. He sees this opportunity. He looks around Baltimore. He goes, God, there's this hole that the Colts left behind. I might be able to fill that there. He gets some local money behind, not a lot, but enough to start it up. But his real genius was in putting the franchise together, because his 2 hires, he hires as the head coach Don Matthews, who is in the short list of the greatest coaches in CFL history. And then he hires a young up-and-comer named Jim Popp to be the general manager, who is still in the CFL, though all these many years later. And they understand the league, they understand the players, they understand, what's going to work and what isn't. And they build, it's extraordinary when you think about it. In one short year, they build a team that makes it to the Grey Cup game in Vancouver.
Yeah, that's fascinating. And it's also interesting, too, that, obviously a strong allegiance and a desire to rekindle as directly and figuratively as possible the Colts name. But obviously the Colts name became a problem, and very early on at that.
Yeah, and let's be clear, Spiros' whole strategy was directed at resurrecting the Colts. So he goes, they had these things called Colt Corrals in Baltimore, and they still existed, and they were like these like little area fan clubs with each one, and he went to them and said, look, I'm going to bring a football team. He brings the old Colts back. Tom Maddie is a really important part of the Colts franchise. He gets Johnny Unitas on board. I want to say John Mackey was part of the group as well. So like he is selling this tie, you know, we are bringing the Colts back. Yes, it's a different league and all the rest of it, but we are bringing the Colts back. So the NFL's original tact is to ignore them, and then when it becomes clear that you know, they're going to see the light of day, and also they're very, very popular in Baltimore for what they are, and more importantly, what they aren't, which is an NFL team. And the whole backdrop of this is the city of Baltimore extending their middle finger to the NFL. The NFL decides they're going to come in and legislate against that Baltimore team using the name Colts. So even at that, it ends up as a win for Spiros and his team, because they're still fighting those dogs from the NFL, the league that ripped our team. Well, now they're not going to let us use your name. Well, you know what you can do with that. So it's like I said, it just became a great story. Now it left them without a name, but at the very first game, and I think we're probably going to get to the Sports Illustrated story, but so the very first game, the PA announcer is announcing the Baltimore team, and he's not allowed to say Colts, so he goes, ladies and gentlemen, your 1993 Baltimore, and he doesn't say anything, in the whole crowd, I believe there's like 45,000 at Memorial Stadium, screams out Colts. So that's kind of that's the story there. They go through the year, they're known by various things. They finally settle on the Baltimore CFLers. And then the next year they adopt the name the Stallions. But I think for the vast majority of the people of Baltimore, that they were the Colts.
Yeah, and obviously the iconography, or was emblematic or reminiscent of a horse or some equine kind of related thing, right? So I think they probably did just about as good a job as you could do without sort of officially crossing the line into trademark land.
Yeah, and they couldn't have paid for the publicity they got from this thing, too. Like I said, in the end, I mean, the NFL, God bless them, is good at a lot of things, but I don't think their strength might be playing the villain at whatever the issue is, and they certainly played that role well in this case, and just going back and reading over it, and I'm, not going to be able to pull details. I do remember it's in the book, but, they had this lawyer who's speaking, in very clinical terms about how they can't, this is an infringement on our copyright and on our property and all the rest of it. In the meantime, you can just see the people in Baltimore jeering at them. So, like I said, it's, everything that Baltimore team, it couldn't have broken more correctly for them than it did that first year, right down to the team they put on the field.
Well, it seems like they were. It was almost a year two sort of imprint of success, or at least that this was a smart move on the CFL's part to get into the United States, and Baltimore was, frankly, probably the shining example of why to do so. Because what you mentioned, right? This is a team that went all the way to the Grey Cup and lost in the last seconds, right, to the BC Lions at BC. On the last-second field goal, and my understanding, again, my crack research, right? You're the pro, not me. That there was actually a small profit made in that first year.
Yeah, there was. I don't think it was a whole lot, because as things would transpire, as Spiros was papering the house, but they were also putting 40,000 people in there, and their payroll wasn't that high. So, I think they did reasonably well, and they certainly did well by the city. It seems to me the mayor of Baltimore ends up as a champion of the Colts incarnation on top of everything else. So this all plays a role in it. But no, you're right. The CFL could always point to, all this crazy stuff, so we'll get to Las Vegas and Shreveport in a minute, but while all the crazy stuff is going on with them, they can point to Baltimore and go, but you see, we know what we're doing. Look at how well Baltimore is doing. Look at this shining example of our vision. And again, I think they got a bit of a pass just because of Baltimore for 2 of those years anyways.
Well, okay, so for Baltimore and all its success out of the gate and its rekindling of the passion for football in the city of Baltimore, let's talk about Shreveport and Las Vegas, perhaps in that order. So Shreveport, right, has a bit of a history, right? It was the second destination for the World Football League, right, back in the 70s, right? The steamer, yep. Which itself was a removal from, I want to say it was the Houston club of the WFL in '74 that relocated there in mid-season. Craziness there, but Shreveport, not in the biggest metropolitan area in the country, however, very much in the heart of sort of Texarkana, southern Midwest, if you will, football country with lots of college teams and all that kind of stuff, but. Maybe some background as to who was behind the Shreveport franchise, courtesy of the CFL, and maybe some of the shenanigans that sort of went on in the heart of Louisiana there.
I don't know if I have enough. My phone has enough battery to get into the Glebermans, but so the owner operators are a father and a son combination. Bernie Gleberman, the father, and the money, and his son Lonnie. And the story goes that Bernie gave Lonnie the football teams to operate just to keep him away from his businesses that actually made money. That was kind of the loss leader. So they own the Ottawa Rough Riders through a series of circumstances which are far too complicated to replicate here, and I don't think I can recall them all anyways. But as is always the case with the CFL, it's Byzantine, and it's convoluted, and it's crazy, and it includes Dexter Manley showing up as the face of the franchise and the star that's going to sell out the Ottawa team. Well, during the off-season between 92 and 93, Lonnie Gleberman shows up at a bar in Ottawa with his girlfriend. People start mocking him. He beaks off to one of them, and the guy punches him in the mouth. And that's it. The Glebermans. This is the act that drives the Glebermans out of Ottawa. I am still unclear why they chose Shreveport as their destination, other than I know they got a sweetheart deal. The stadium, which was city owned, it was on an exhibition grounds, and there was a bit of a history of football there. And in the Gleberman's mind, that was good enough. So they set up operation there. They hired John Heward as the head coach. No, I'm sorry, they hired Forrest Gregg as their. Was it Heward or Gregg first, whoever it was? And
John Heward was the first head coach, and then I guess the Glebermans sort of came over the general manager Albrecht at the time and said, "That's right."
Yeah, he doesn't. No, I'm sorry. I don't believe Heward makes it to the first game before he's fired and replaced by Forrest Gregg. And this J.I. Albrecht character, who's been around the CFL for a number of years, and they're both a little barmy, to tell you the truth. But they set up their operation at the exhibition grounds where the football stadium is, and much hilarity ensues. Shall we get into that?
Well, yeah. I mean, they were sort of dreadful on the field, and it sounds like they had some decent support from the locals. And you're mentioning, by the way, there is a football heritage, right? I mean, they're in sort of the Texas and LSU and Arkansas, and they have the Independence Bowl, the college bowl game every year that was sort of started up in the 70s. So there's definitely a football culture there, but it's, again, not the largest market. But it just seems like they, I don't know, it just seems like they, but before we get to sort of their attempts to relocate the team, which is an interesting story in and of itself, it seems to me that they also were indicative of an issue that beset a number of the teams that came to the United States from the CFL with this, shall we say, challenge from high school football on Friday nights and college football on Saturdays once the second half of the CFL season got underway, right? A real threat or a challenge, right, to the gate and sustaining interest in a team as the season wore on.
Yeah, I don't know how much that impacted the Shreveport franchise. I know for a fact it had a huge impact on Birmingham and probably Memphis as well.
True.
I mean, Shreveport was just kind of Looney Tunes from the start. So their very first training camp, like I said, the football stadium is on an exhibition grounds, and there's this big agricultural barn that Albrecht brings bunk beds in, and this is where the players are housed during training camp. Right next to it is there's some kind of wild animal component to this fairground, and this just kills me. They have a tiger in a cage, so every day the players go out, they practice, they come back, and they walk past this caged tiger. And of course, some of them start looking at it, and some of them look at the tiger, look at the tiger. So this one day they're doing it, a player named Johnny Scott, who's actually a very good CFL player, played in the league for a number of years. He's looking at the tiger, he's pointing at it, that the tiger turns around, lifts its tails up, and covers Johnny Scott in tiger urine. So that's kind of the story of Johnny Scott and the tiger. But there was that whole there were monkeys, and I guess when the players are trying to sleep at night, their chattering kept them up at night. You just try and imagine like the worst set of circumstances for a football team, and that's what Shreveport was. So they get through that first year. I think they lose their first 14 games, something like that. They finally win one, and they finish the season 1-15, and then come back, and they get a quarterback the next year. They bring Billy Joe Tolliver in the next year, and they're a little more entertaining. But it's just kind of the die has been cast. There just isn't enough there to support a team.
All right. So when were they thinking about moving the team to Norfolk, Virginia? Was that during that first season, or was that after the?
No, I believe it comes in the second season,
okay.
and of course by this time the Glebermans have run up all manner of bills with the city of Shreveport, which owns the stadium, owns the fairground, et cetera, et cetera. So they start casting around, looking for other cities. And Norfolk, Virginia is very enthusiastic about attracting for a lot of the same reasons all these American cities are. They're big on football. It's, they don't really have a franchise to call their own. They look around, they say, well, they're big. Some of these teams seem to be doing well. So they have a series of meetings with the people in Norfolk, Virginia, and of course they phone, the people in Norfolk phone the people in Shreveport to find out what the Glebermans are about, find out, they've got a list of debts as long as their arm, and then their interest wanes after that.
Maybe we should talk quickly about the Great Tucker Caper. Is that
awesome?
Right?
Yeah, no, again, it's right there, like with the Tiger story and so many of the other ones in CFL expansion wars. So the Gleberman, among other things, he was a collector of vintage automobiles, and he actually had one of the very few Tuckers manufactured. Not only that, it was roadworthy, and I believe the story goes as a gesture of good faith, he lent it to a museum or some civic building in Shreveport to show off. Well, when they start running up debts, the city of Shreveport takes a long look at this very valuable vintage car and says, well, I think that would satisfy some of them. So Gleberman has a lawyer whose name escapes me right now, but he gives him the keys to the car and instructs him to drive it out of Shreveport as fast as he can. I can't remember if he's headed to Norfolk. I think that might be part of the story, but I'm not sure. But he's driving this thing, and of course it runs out of gas. Of course he's by the side of the road when the police pull by. Of course the police ask, what's this all about? and the car ends up back in Shreveport. I don't know what happened to it at the end, but that was the great Tucker caper with the Shreveport Pirates.
That's just insane. I mean, it's just absolutely insane. So that has to be another episode at some point. We've got to get into this story of the Shreveport Pirates. Okay, but so if that weren't enough, okay, right? So kudos to the CFL. Now we're talking about Las Vegas. All right, so let's talk about that sort of craziness. The Las Vegas posse, arguably, based on my crack research, the least successful of all these teams that expanded. They only lasted a year, this 1994 season, or perhaps you have a conjecture on that.
No. In fact, you can easily make the case they are the worst professional franchise in the history of professional sports.
Interesting.
They made the Shreveport Pirates look like a Fortune 500 company. So it starts off, the owner is Nick Maletti, is a dude out of Cleveland who had owned, I believe he owned the Indians for a while. He definitely owned the Cavaliers. He owned the Cleveland WHA team. And he's very much a part of this sports entrepreneur, owner, operator, hustler, entertainer, producer who's going to make it big. And, when you think about it, you think of, boy, look at what the hockey team's done there. Maybe he was just ahead of his time because there is no professional football franchise in Las Vegas. So he goes in there. He hires Ron Meyer, a former NFL coach, as his head coach. He goes out and he spends money on some fairly big-name players, the biggest of which was Tamarick Vanover, who'd been an All-American at Florida State, some other pretty good CFL players, and they set up operations. So the Las Vegas Posse's first training camp is in the parking lot of the Riviera Hotel. And they set up this makeshift CFL field. It's actually it's basically, they bring in some plywood, lay down some cement, put down some ground, put grass in, and it's 70 yards long, and there are no field goal posts. So that's where and this is also the dead of summer in Las Vegas. So they end up practicing in routinely temperatures that exceed 100 degrees. So that's funny enough, but the other great part is they encourage the players to cash their game checks at the Riviera Hotel. So, of course, they go in there, and there are more than one player, unfortunately, lost their entire paycheck on the gaming tables at the Riviera Hotel. So this is just the start of the franchise. Now, if I may, the assistant coach at the time is a guy named Jeff Reinbold, who's one of my all-time favorite characters in sports. He has coached in the CFL for well over 30 years, and he was the boy special teams coach for Ron Meyer that year, and he is an inveterate storyteller. So he was kind of my eyes and ears to that first year in Las Vegas, and the stories he tells about Meyer. Everywhere you go, he had to make an appearance, and he had slick back hair, and he never took his sunglasses off. But he was kind of this larger-than-life character who was going to sell football in Las Vegas until he didn't.
Well, they also they didn't draw very well either. They were playing at Sam Boyd Stadium.
That's right. Yeah.
I think this is also emblematic, I believe, because this is the first, when I was doing my research, seemed to be sort of the first of what looked to be a recurring issue, and that is, I guess, for lack of a better word, compromise being made on the field size. Right, the Canadians field obviously being much longer and a bit wider than the NFL franchises. Or the league, but it seems like Las Vegas in particular had to make a bunch of concessions, if you will, on the actual replication of the CFL field size, no?
Yeah, you know what? I wasn't aware of them so much and this is a huge part of the Memphis story. So, but it wouldn't surprise me. I mean, Sam Boyd was where the University of Nevada at Las Vegas played, and it was it was very similar to Hornets Field. It was basically 30,000 seats, but they were all like kind of metallic grandstands, and it was out like half an hour, 45 minutes from the Strip. So, it was funny, reading the resource material So obviously there's an interest factor there, but Canadian writers go down there. And one of them asked one of the bookies at one of the sports books about what he thought about this idea of bringing Canadian professional football to Las Vegas, and he said they're not going to last the year. Like why would anybody leave this? And he looked around, at his air-conditioned casino and go all the way out there to watch football they don't know about and don't really care about. Turned out to be prophetic, because that's exactly what happened. But there was, of course, more adventures along the way.
Well, I get the sense that they were looking very much to fold by the middle of the season. I mean, their average attendance was something in the neighborhood of just under 9,000 a game, and I think their second to last home game, they drew what I guess became a lasting and still lasting record low crowd of 2,350 people, the lowest recorded attendance in CFL history in 1990.
It's just one calamity after another for Las Vegas. So in their first game, so this is going to be, and it's nationally televised in Canada, and I believe they're playing the Saskatchewan Roughriders, and they find somebody to sing the Canadian national anthem, and they've gone through, and they find this guy. He's recommended to them. They go through an agency. Yeah, here, take this guy. He's sung national anthems all over. Well, the guy gets there, and he gets about 5 notes in, and he loses the tune completely, and he basically ends up singing our national anthem to the tune of "Oh Christmas Tree," and it has since become it is among the most widely viewed sports videos in the history of Canada. It still is, and this guy, his name is Dennis Casey Park. And I invite anybody who's listened to Google it, because it is an absolutely epic moment. As I said, from there, it just things are just spiraling downward, and they're not drawing anybody, and they're running out of money. Jeff Reinbold told me, they would write their they would write their game plans on the back of one sheet, and then they were ordered to turn it around, because they had to use both sides of the paper. So they'd have they'd have the game plan on one side, and then next week's game plan on the other. They fired all the cheerleaders. They fired everybody. They ended up with about 2 or 3 people working in the office, and memorably, the board. There was a couple of people on the board of directors, and they called a meeting, and they turfed Nick Maletti out, which led to this immortal line. It's one of my favorite lines in all of sports, from Ron Meyer, the head coach. He said, "This is the first time the owner was fired before I was." So that's kind of the legacy of the Las Vegas posse.
So, based on your
research, I'm sorry, one final thing. So, as you said, they drew about 2,000 for their second last. The CFL takes a look at that. They have one more home game scheduled. They decide they're going to play it in Edmonton, because they're not going to draw anybody, and at least people in Edmonton will go up to will show up for this last spasm of the Las Vegas posse. So the Las Vegas posse's last home game was played in Edmonton, Alberta.
So what was a story that you could tell about Nick Maletti, right? Cleveland guy. What the hell's he doing with a franchise in this sort of expansionary thing in Las Vegas?
I don't know a ton about him, and I don't know why he gets involved, other than he's one of these characters who just seems to be endlessly attracted to the action, to something new coming along, and because he appears in the WHA, and he's got to get the Cleveland Cruiser, and again, he was wealthy, and he was a bit of an entrepreneur, but it was more the hustle, it was the action he was attracted to, and that seems to be the common denominator with so many of the characters that go in and out of this story of American expansion.
Okay, can you describe sort of the denouement of this story, because it doesn't end kind of with the team whimpering away, right? There's more fun and frivolity to be had, even though the posse doesn't really technically exist after the end of the season, because it looks like Maletti tried to figure out some other places to take whatever was remaining of this team and move it elsewhere.
So one of the endlessly entertaining but frustrating parts of this book, of doing this book, is I kept running into these stories where, now Name a city. And I know I listed them at one point, and it seems to me there were somewhere in the order of 48 American cities which were listed as viable and possible franchise sites for CFL teams, and they are all over the map. So, yes, I'm sure he tried to move it somewhere. I'm sure he tried to sell it to some other city. I'm just not sure where. And, at the end of the day, it was, probably it didn't really matter because they weren't going to take it and he wasn't going to put any money into it. But it's absolutely remarkable the number of cities, whether it's Orlando, Florida, or whether it's Miami, and then a whole host of smaller ones. I'm trying to remember the one in New England, the whole plan. Yeah, we're going to go in there and we're going to bring Doug Flutie back and we're going to build this team. And of course, it never saw the light of day. So it's a common theme. It recurs over and over again during this period. But I had a really hard time trying to figure out if any of them were credible, because in the midst of it, there's just ample evidence to suggest 99.9% of them weren't.
That's interesting. I did a little bit of research, and it looked like, of all people, Jimmy Buffett got involved near the end of this thing with the idea of possibly moving this team to the even more burgeoning metropolis of Jackson, Mississippi. It's fascinating, and it winds up the diaspora goes into places like Miami, and the Miami Manatees as a name, and all that kind of stuff. But I guess it's just indicative, and this is exactly the kind of stuff that we just obsess about and become fascinated by. Okay, so we've talked about two sort of, let's call them disastrous. That's probably no better way to describe it, franchises. But that doesn't stop the CFL now, does it? Right. So before we get into the last season of this craziness, what is what can you tell sort of the quality of play and or the health of the CFL, and were people now in year two, certainly with the success, the relative success of Baltimore, maybe overlooking the Shreveport and Las Vegas debacles? What is from what you could tell, what was the sort of feeling amongst our northern neighbors around whether this was working or not?
Well, yeah, I think toward the end of year two, it becomes obvious to everybody this is. But I think there's also a time that, like I said, they could always point to Baltimore. And so the 94 Grey Cup game in Vancouver turns out to be this watershed moment. Last second, BC ends up pulling out, and it was an upset because that Baltimore team is stacked. Baltimore comes back next year as the Stallions and absolutely drills Doug Flutie and the Calgary Stampeders in the Grey Cup game in a lopsided, and there are still a lot of people who think that Baltimore team was the best team in CFL history. They had at least half a dozen guys go to the CFL or go to the NFL from that team the next year, and they were stacked on offense, stacked on defense. And that Calgary team they beat was very, very good. So they could point to that, but there's just so much other stuff coming on. And, it's my sense in going back over that time is people just kind of, they paid a little bit of attention to Baltimore. For a year, maybe 2 years, they paid a little bit of attention to Sacramento. The other teams are just kind of background noise. They didn't really make a dent. I guess we'll get into Birmingham and Memphis here shortly, and then the San Antonio team just had the 1 year run, and they were, existed on the fumes of that Sacramento franchise. But by the end of year three, the '94 season, I think it was pretty apparent that this thing just didn't have legs.
Well, it's ironic because you're mentioning the gold miners of Sacramento. They wound up going and becoming the San Antonio Texans in the Alamo Dome, which was ironic because, right, that was supposed to be when Sacramento joined the league to be the sister franchise of the then, the original San Antonio franchise. So, but by whatever means, right, San Antonio finally got its franchise, albeit in what ultimately became the last of the three American seasons of the CFL. But plus, besides that moving, and obviously the Las Vegas Posse died a relatively ugly death, two new franchises, right? And these are interesting, right? The Memphis Mad Dogs and the Birmingham Barracudas, not the names I would have given these teams, I guess, but they do speak to a theme that we've heard over time, right? Where these are two examples of markets that have been constantly overlooked by the NFL and have rabid fan bases and have been wooed and dragged out. It looks like again now with the reincarnated XFL and the Alliance of American Football. These are always on the short list, these two markets, for quote unquote professional football franchises, because there's absolutely an appetite there and a dearth of the pro game in the form of it not having them not having an NFL franchise. So it seems to me like I'm surprised, frankly, given the WFL, given the USFL, given the WLAF, all before the AFL even, this period of time, that Memphis and Birmingham would only come in the third season of this experiment. You'd think they would have been like on the short list in the beginning.
Yeah, no, you're right, and the history and everything. If you're going to look for a market, those would be the two ones. Not only that, I think pretty quickly, the owner-operators are identified, and unlike so many of the others in this era, these guys are men of means. There's a substance. So in Birmingham, you've got the insurance magnate Art Williams, who would go on to own the Tampa Bay Lightning, I believe, and in Memphis, you've got Fred Smith, who's one of the driving forces behind, help me, his name of this corporation. I'm just blanking out.
Federal Express. Yeah, sure.
Thank you. It's so FedEx. So I mean, you've got men of tremendous means. And in the case of Art Williams, he attempted to follow the Baltimore model. He brought in proven CFL men. He spent money on Matt Dunnigan, who was probably he was one of the 2-3 best. He wasn't quite in Flutie's class, but he was in the next notch below. CFL quarterbacks. They had a number of CFL, really good CFL players they brought in. And it started off, it was encouraging. What they found was once the University of Alabama started their football season, nobody really cared too much about the Birmingham Barracudas. So I remember looking at the attendance figures. It seemed to me they start off in the high 20s and then the low 20s, and then you get to September, and now all of a sudden it's 12,000, it's 15,000, it's 11,000. So they just couldn't make a go of it, which is unfortunate because like I said, Williams seemed to want to make a legitimate effort to build a franchise there. Memphis, unfortunately, again, they go out, they hire a CFL guy. I'm sorry, I'm blanking out on the name. I'll come back to in a minute. They hire Damon Allen, another very good CFL quarterback. They bring Pepper Rogers in, who's a big name in NCAA coaching, and it just doesn't work. In fact, like Memphis is more famous for the stadium they played in than anything they did on the field. It just by now any momentum that had been generated by the little bit of momentum that had been generated by Sacramento and by Baltimore had dissipated.
Well, you had mentioned earlier, and I think these are the two franchises in particular, right? And you hinted at it with Birmingham, right? These are two quintessential, shall we say, Southern football markets that college football and on Fridays, frankly, high school football seems to dominate the landscape. And it looks like both of these franchises argued to the CFL management that they, as the season dragged on, that they should play their games on Sunday afternoons to avoid competing with those Saturday college football and Friday night high school football. But of course, it also belies the fact that Sundays are, when last we checked, NFL football days, right? So it doesn't seem like there's a win-win there in any way, shape, or form. But you also hint at Memphis, right? So, and maybe this is probably the best example. I'm sorry I sort of maybe blew this line earlier, but what of the stadium? What of the Liberty Bowl? Because, as I said earlier, right, many compromises seem to have been made with just about every one of these American franchises around the integrity of the CFL markings and field size. But it seems like Memphis really went out of its way to kind of truly compromise itself now, didn't it?
Yeah, they were. I mean, they were trying to pound a square peg into a round hole, and they couldn't do it. So, I mean, they fashion a field which to the naked eye looks a bit like the Canadian field. I'm sorry for people out there. It's 110 yards long, 65 yard wide, and they should have 20-yard end zones. If you do the math quickly and look at that stadium in Memphis, you'd quickly realize a field that size could not be fit. So their response was to make and I actually talked to the guy who he was a writer for the Regina Leader Post, pasted off, and what he discovered was the yards they were using were actually 33 inches long. So that took care of that problem. Now they still have to squeeze the end zones in. So they ended up kind of jerry-rigging something that was like a rhombus or a parallelogram or something, but it wasn't like the rectangle you see in most stadiums. And there was also an abutment that came out at one end, and I gather, I didn't see it, but it came right up almost to the end zone line. So Danny McManus, the quarterback for the BC Lions, looked in and said, "Oh God, that's a lawsuit waiting to happen." Now nobody, there weren't any serious injuries as a result, but again, it's kind of a metaphor for the whole Memphis and maybe even the whole idea of American expansion. It just didn't fit.
So to back up for a second, you're mentioning that so. The Liberty Bowl grounds crew were marking yard markers, right, which is 36 inches, as 33 inches each.
That's right, yeah. So
that's how they somehow snuck. Yeah, did anybody recognize this, or was it kind of I'm just curious as to like how this was found out.
It was later, and I don't know. I can't believe, but I'm pretty sure. Like with the research I did, I think had somebody mentioned it at the time, it would have been a story, but it never was. So I don't know if people were just kind of willing to let that one pass for the good of the league or whatever it was. But
it's almost
that was that.
Yeah, it's almost ingenious, I guess. In
retrospect, right? Sure.
We're going to have a few of these the pictures of this stadium configuration on our website at goodseatsstillavailable.com when we post this episode. But it's also interesting too because you could clearly see the end zones were truncated and/or it almost looks like kind of what deferences are made to certain Arena Football League venues, right?
Okay.
See the end zones kind of clipped off and not being sort of fully rectangular. I also saw some pictures that it looks like to widen the field. There's a grass field or at least at the time was at Liberty, the Liberty Bowl, right? But they also, if I'm not mistaken, I think they even added to expand it on the sides, AstroTurf around the actual grass field. So in some respects, you almost had like an old Comiskey Park baseball thing back in the 70s where you had, AstroTurf on one part of the field and actual natural grass on the other part, which is just insane, it seems. In the 1990s, that's insane.
No, I know. You talk about this stuff and you think, geez, are we talking about, 60s or 70s? It doesn't feel like it's that long ago. And yet it was, I'm sorry, I'd completely forgotten about, and that was their way of, extending the field, of putting this kind of row of AstroTurf along the sidelines to give the appearance that it was a regulation CFL field.
Well, according to your research, then, what sort of maybe we can describe and we round home here on this one. Give us a sense of sort of how all this sort of came to a conclusion. This sort of, I guess, what ultimately became an experiment. It seems like there was some movement to try to get a television contract with CBS here in the States post this third season. It seems that there were some signs of maybe trying to continue to do this. But what, in your sort of estimation, was sort of how did it sort of unfold as in a collapse, if you will, and an abandonment ultimately of staying in the United States for this league?
Well, it seems as simple, and I'm going on, the story Larry Smith told me. It just seemed like the American owners banded together and said, "Not like we just can't do. We're not going to do this anymore." And they meet. They meet in Toronto, and I gather it's. Most of these guys had access to private planes or within it, so everybody flies in Toronto for these final meetings, and that's it. And it seems to me it actually takes place at the end of the '94 season. So I don't think there's any specific event that triggers it or some great cataclysm. I think it was just the sheer arithmetic of the losses. Is what weighed them down, and that was it. But I mean, and again, there's a whole bunch of other stories connected with it. Art Williams paid his expansion fee in full, and of course he was apoplectic when he found out that nobody else did. So I'm pretty sure he ends up suing the league to try and get some of it back. So it just turns out to be a schmozzle, but it dies kind of quietly and without a lot of the furor you would think would accompany something, fairly significant story in Canadian sports. It just kind of, well, here they go again, and they were gone, and they were gone seemingly as quickly as they'd appeared.
Do you think the NFL ever feared, or feared is maybe a strong word, but was concerned about the CFL? Because I do think there are a bunch of folks who think that. And of course, this is not the cause because you just mentioned that it wasn't sort of one real thing. But when the NFL in late '95 announced that the Cleveland Browns were going to move to Baltimore, it almost seemed like if there was any life in the CFL that might be going forward, striking a dagger in the heart of the fledgling Baltimore, don't call them Colts franchise Stallions, was basically dealt a death knell by the NFL moving back into Baltimore.
Yeah, I can see that, but boy, talk about overkill. I mean, again, as things transpire, they were starting to run out of money. As I said before, Spiros was papering the house. He had no money of his own, so I question how long it was going to go, and especially considering what was happening to all the other franchises around them. And the other part of that is I think I mentioned this earlier, it's either 1996 or 1997, the NFL arranges an interest-free loan, which goes a long way towards keeping the CFL afloat before there's another series of events that happen, which really solidifies the league and kind of moves it out of this danger area. So I wouldn't hold anything against the NFL. And I would believe that, but again, I kind of have a hard time believing they would be that petty, and that mean-spirited that they would, knock it out just for that reason. I think what they saw was there was a market, a very vital, vibrant market still in Baltimore that they needed to get a hold of.
Yeah, it almost seems like I sort of thought I read some rumors that there were, the NFL was thinking about maybe even flexing its muscles and trying to put a team in Toronto circa 1996 or so.
That's fair. I mean yeah, and again that has been that has been a long held CFL story about the NFL going into Toronto, and it's taken on various shapes and forms over the years, but it's never come to fruition, and it won't now.
All right, so what is the lasting legacy? I think there's actually one specific lasting legacy. You hinted at it earlier, but the Stallions wound up kind of round tripping, if you will, and coming back to be a part of the ongoing strength now of the CFL. Maybe you want to speak to that, and then maybe generally. What do you think was learned from all this? Was this just sort of an historical detour of crazy madcapness for 3 years, or were there lessons learned and/or things that maybe came out of it that were lessons learned and positive going forward?
Yeah, no, I think there were, and I apologize to your listeners in advance because this is going to come from a Canadian perspective. And I think the overriding lesson that was learned is the CFL really only works as a Canadian entity. And the thing which sustains it, which drives it, which allows it to survive is its history, is its legacy, is its deep connection in these communities, in some cases that go back over 100 years. And that's what really has allowed it to survive. And that might be an overly romantic portrait of what the league is, but I really believe that. And when, the states came in, and these kind of like, it was kind of a get-rich-quick scheme, trying to exploit a league that was in dire financial straits at the time, but it just didn't wash with Canadian football fans. And I think they needed that kind of, I don't know if scare is the right word, but they needed that to realize, to return to its roots as what it was. So that's kind of the overriding lesson. Now, in terms of the CFL, there are three things that happened afterwards, because really they're on the verge of folding in 1995 and 96. They are just hanging on, but three things happen. Number one is David Braley, who's a wealthy industrialist in Hamilton, who's always had a liking for the league, has built his businesses up to the point that he now wants to, do a good thing. And he moves in, buys the BC Lions, operates them, absorbs huge losses over the next 3, 4, 5 years, but gets them up and running and makes them a viable franchise. In Montreal, Jim Spiros takes the ball. I'll just go through this quickly. Jim Spiros ends up taking the Baltimore team to Montreal, operating it. It is going down the tubes again when a couple of things happen. One is they find a wealthy New Yorker named Bob Wettenhall to take over the franchise, and he basically does for Montreal what David Braley does for Vancouver, gives it stability, gives it a bankroll they can fall on. The other part is Montreal is still playing at the Big O, which is the 65,000-seat monstrosity, and they're drawing 10 to 12,000 because, and bear with me, but there's a payoff at the end of this, they cannot get Olympic Stadium for a crucial playoff game, so they end up having to go to McGill Stadium, which is closer to downtown, which is this lovely outdoor stadium on the campus of McGill University.
Yeah, I've been
they end up playing.
It's beautiful. It's lovely.
Yeah, it is. So they end up playing their playoff game there. It seats 18,000. They get 18,000 there. They decide that's it. We're going to move there full time, and they've been there ever since. So that's the thing. They solidify two of their three biggest markets in Montreal and BC, and then the third thing is cable sports comes a little late to Canada, but it has arrived, and TSN, the sports network, is out looking for programming, and they go all in on the CFL, and they end up signing a series of television contracts that gives the league operating capital and really ensures its long-term survivability. So there it is. There's the précis on the history of saving the CFL.
Well, there you go. So, and obviously it's been quite thriving ever since. Where do you think the league goes, from here on out? Right? It's clearly, I would argue, much more exciting than the American version of the game. It's certainly wide open. It's more passing, and I've always found it to be a much more, shall we say, modern and sleeker version of the game. But, how much further? I mean, can the league grow beyond 8-10 teams? In Canada, can you get into smaller markets or is it just going to be, sustainable and steady as she goes and incrementally growing over time? Is there talk of further expansion, but perhaps this time in Canada? Are there other markets to go in Canada? What are the thoughts there?
Well, there is one. So I mean, the long-held dream of the CFL is to put a franchise in Halifax, and that pretty well covers the country. Now you've got a team in the Maritimes in Quebec, Ontario, all the way through. Now, the first talk of a Halifax franchise goes back to the early 1980s, and J.I. Albrecht, the character who shows up with the Shreveport Pirates, is instrumental in that. It never gets off the ground. They're trying hard now. Again, on some level, the TV contract, such as it is now, almost covers teams' payroll. So, if you can get like a stadium that generates enough revenue, then you can sell 20 to 25,000 seats. You can make a go of it in the CFL, and that's what they're hoping for. They still don't have the venue and they don't have an owner yet, but there is really a concerted effort to try and get it there. Anything beyond that, I think, is probably a question of the reach exceeding the grasp. I'm just not sure. Quebec City, there's been a presumption that Quebec City could support a CFL team. The college team there, the Laval University team, does very well. Probably not. There's some thought about maybe one of the northern suburbs in Toronto, but I think I honestly think the CFL maxed out would be a 10-team league, and I'm sorry, I just don't see them going back to the States. I just don't see it happening for the reasons we've talked about here. I just don't think there is any appetite to get back there, and as long as they're not facing another financial crisis like they were in the early 90s, I don't think there will be.
All right, last question: the CFL and its place in Canadian sports and or pro sports landscape. Obviously, Major League Soccer has had some success. You've got the startup of the new Canadian Professional League in soccer coming soon. Hockey always been sort of the national sport. Where does the CFL sort of fit or rank in the Canadian sports landscape? Is it, and obviously it's got a heritage and a rich one at that. Is it strong? Is it weak? Is it on the rise again? Where sort of does it fit, I guess, in the overall sort of Canadian sports fabric?
It depends where you're asking that question and the age of the person you're asking it to. So I am 62. So I'd say people like what do they call that? The baby boomer echo. For those people who were raised in the 6-channel universe, who weren't bombarded, the CFL is such an integral part of their upbringing. It was almost the equal of the NHL, and because there were so many more Canadian cities involved, I'd say you could make the argument it might even be bigger in some sectors. So for people of that age, the CFL will always have a near and dear spot. Unfortunately, the audience for the CFL has been graying, and they've had, especially in Montreal and Toronto and Vancouver, a hard time attracting the younger crowd. Now, like I said, it depends where you ask that question. In the prairies, in Edmonton, in Calgary, in Saskatchewan, in Winnipeg, there's still an it factor to the CFL, which kind of defies reason. And there's NHL teams in Edmonton and Calgary, but it just seems its roots are so deep in those communities that the attraction is there, and it will take a lot more than that to drive it out. So it's kind of holding its own right now. It's the television money makes it viable and makes the whole thing work. I would like to see better attendance in my hometown, Vancouver, better attendance in Toronto. Montreal's a little shaky right now, and those are the 3 biggest markets in the CFL. But the other 6 smaller markets are all doing fine. And the CFL, as nothing else, has demonstrated this resiliency and survivability over the years, and that's really at the core of its identity. And I maybe I'm seeing what I want to see, but I don't see that changing in the future.
Well, look, I think this is a fascinating story, even though it is an asterisk, if you will, in the overall history. Why don't you tell our audience more about the book, the name of it, where they can find it, and all that kind of good stuff. How to follow you on Twitter.
Well, it's called End Zones and Border Wars, and it's available on Amazon. If you can find it in the books, and I actually wrote it about 5-6 years ago now. So if you can still find it in bookstores, God bless you. But I don't think I could, even in Vancouver. But it's out there. I've written 3 books. I wrote one about the WHA. I wrote one about the 1987 Canada Cup, and they found an audience. I was a little disappointed this book found an audience, and I was warned against writing it that there just isn't a market for it, that people aren't that interested in the CFL. And it did okay by Canadian book standards. But I probably should have realized when I was shopping it around and got, shut down by the publishing firm that published my first two books that it was going to be a tough sell. So, I mean, it's still out there. It's like $20. I can't promise you anything, Tim, but I can promise you'll get $20 worth of entertainment out of this book.
I am telling you, I don't know what other show goes to this great lengths to get into the sheer arcana, if that's a word, of things like pro football in the 1990s, the Canadian Football League, and its experiment, if you will, with placing franchises south of the border in the United States. I mean, where else are you going to hear about stories about the Shreveport Pirates and the Baltimore CFLers and their renaming of to the Stallions and the Las Vegas Posse? What the hell was going on there? I mean, amazing stories. And I'm sure you folks in all these different markets in the United States may remember these franchises, especially in Baltimore, where they were quite successful. Sacramento, you gold miners fans, you are not forgotten, and others like you as well. We thank Ed Willis for regaling us with this interesting sidebar of Canadian Football League history, and it's North American football history for that matter. And a very interesting part of the overall fabric of the history of the sport, both here and in Canada. The name of the book is called End Zones and Border Wars, the Era of American Expansion in the CFL. It is written, as I said before, by our guest Ed Willis, and it is published by Harbor, and it is available, as Ed said, on Amazon and frankly, wherever books are found. And of course, if you go to our website at goodseatsstillavailable.com and search up the episode number 65, can you believe it? Our interview with Ed Willis, you will see a link to that book. You will see some interesting images. We've got some pictures of the Liberty Bowl as it was constructed and reconfigured for the Memphis Mad Dogs, and all kinds of other hilarity and frivolity from those three interesting, shall we say, years of Canadian/American football in the CFL on that website. So by all means, bookmark it and go there as early and often as you can. It's goodseatsstillavailable.com, and we appreciate that. Of course, you're going to find our social media feeds there too, but you can also write these down and go directly to those places too if you'd like. On Instagram, we're at Good Seats Still Available. On Twitter, we're at Good Seats Still. There's a page devoted to us on Facebook as well. And, what can I tell you? There's plenty of ways to get in contact with us, keep in touch with us, see the various promotional items that we have. We've got a newsletter. You can sign up for that on our website, blah, blah, blah. Let's see, what else? We want to thank our friends at Podfly Productions, in particular, the good Dr. Jerry Payne, who painstakingly, get it, haha, puts our pieces together and makes our show sound somewhat decent. We appreciate his efforts, as well as Podfly Productions. And if you want to get a taste of what quality podcast production is all about, make sure you check them out at podfly.net. That's podfly.net, Podfly Productions. And that's it for this week. I appreciate it. This is a fun little nook and cranny that we went down, and we guarantee that we're going to find some more. There's plenty more where that came from. And we encourage you to bookmark us and or subscribe to us and or download us and or whatever you do. Just keep coming back. Hopefully you'll find some more entertaining stories to come here at Good Seats Stillville. Thanks for listening. My name's Tim Hanlon, and until next week, we say a pleasant week to you. Thanks for listening. Bye.